What is up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week, we're doing a deep dive on all things Esper in Aetherdrift. So that's blue-black, that's blue-white, that's black-white. I have been drafting these decks almost exclusively, to be honest, this week. Like, it's gotten to the point where I had been soft forcing them for most of my drafts, and going in kind of expecting to be these decks, partially because they're very fun. I actually think these are the most fun decks to play for me in the format, especially blue-black. I think I've had to choose one. I really enjoy the play patterns of blue-black. But mostly, I think it's a really good time in the format to get these decks as tools in your tool belt. As I'm sure you felt if you're drafting fairly often, green is increasingly drying up more and more. There's more drafts where I feel like the table has 6 people trying to be in green. And so yeah, through my soft forcing of these Esper decks, partially because I like playing them and partially because I feel like they've been pretty open, I feel like I've really figured out a lot of things. I figured out what works, what doesn't. So just want to kind of share that. We're going to go through all 3 decks one by one, talk about individual cards, interactions, stuff like that. Before we do that, I'm going to give my usual Arena Open PSA. There is an Arena Open this weekend. I feel like even more than usual, this one was not advertised. I had a lot of people that are, very in tune with Limited in my Discord being like, wait, what's going on? There's an Arena Open this weekend. And yeah, so if you're watching this and you like to play in those, here is your PSA. And I actually think this episode is going to be fairly helpful because these decks are decks I would be looking to draft in the Open this weekend when a lot of people going in are going to be trying to draft green. All right, so let's kick things off with my beloved here, blue-black Dimir. And at a high level, what this deck is doing is you want to play a bunch of artifacts because a lot of the key cards care about you playing a lot of artifacts. And you're trying to just nickel and dime your opponent out of the game, either with cheap flyers or with Pact Terrors, the 4-mana 3/4 that drains when an artifact or itself enters. The best non-rare card for the deck, and a card that's better than most rares for this deck, is Haunt the Network. This is the 5-mana sorcery that makes 2 Thopters and drains your opponent for the number of artifacts you control. And I really just want to highlight how good, how strong this card is, and how different I think your blue-black decks feel when you have it versus when you don't. In my journey of soft forcing these decks this week, I had a lot of drafts that started out just taking good blue and black cards. I didn't start with a Haunt the Network, but maybe I took a good black rare into a good blue uncommon, and I would just hope to see a copy of Haunt the Network. And in my drafts that saw it, I was like, wow, this worked out. Just even one copy I think is good enough. And the decks that didn't have it, they just had trouble closing. They had trouble stabilizing against the green decks. I think just a big burst of drain after you've done the initial nickel and diming. That is the difference between winning and losing in so many games. So as far as getting into this deck, I would first pick Haunt the Network and try to draft this deck. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's powerful enough to do that. It's also a good splash in blue-white. It's an acceptable splash sometimes in your green decks even, where you sometimes, just end up with Grim Baubles and Vela Heartbikes. Like, if you can get to, 9 artifacts in your green decks, I think Haunt the Network is a pretty good card still. So, very happy to first pick it. If you do find yourself drafting blue-black just because those are the open colors and you don't end up seeing a Haunt the Network, I'm not saying that deck can't be good. I would just lower my expectations of how good that deck is going to be, even if the rest of your deck looks pretty good. Because that's been my experience this week, where I've had blue-black decks that had, 4 Pact Terrors and 3 Wreckage Wicker Folks, a pile of good removal, but didn't get the Haunt. And they just had trouble winning before the green decks took over, or, if I was in the mirror match and my opponent had a Haunt, that would really turn the tide. So, yeah, just, again, want to emphasize how big of a deal I think Haunt is for these decks. Something that I started shifting towards as I drafted more and more of this deck and just started iterating on what I thought the deck should be doing and how that affected its card choices is I shifted from the classic blue-black control mindset of draw some cards, kill some stuff, you'll win eventually, more towards the I actually just want to be ending the game kind of mindset with this deck, right? And this isn't to say that this deck doesn't have good late game. I think that just like any good deck in this format, it's got the tools to compete if the game does go on for a little bit. It's got some card draw generally. It has some pretty good mana sinks. But I think another quality of good decks in this format is that they have the potential to have really great curve outs, right? Really explosive curve outs that threaten to end the game on turn 5. And in this deck, a curve out that looks to end the game pretty quickly is something like Wreckage Wicker Folk on turn 2. That's the 2-mana 1/3 flyer that surveils 2 when it enters into Transit Mage, grabbing a Pact Terror, and then play a Haunt the Network on 5. I mean, the game doesn't literally just end there, but that's a lot of damage. That puts you in a really good spot to close the game. And I think generally that kind of curve out, that kind of explosive draw should be your plan A, right? Build your deck as if you're trying to curve out like that, not as if you're trying to just grind them out with an Ether Siphon or something like that, or just a bunch of card draw. Again, it's the mindset of end the game rather than prolong it, but if the game does go long, it's not like you're just dead in the water. So let's get into the individual cards you're looking for when you're drafting this deck. The commons is where we're going to start, and I think the two most important commons by far for this deck are Wreckage Wickerfolk, which again is the 2-mana 1/3 flyer that when it enters, surveils 2, also an artifact creature. Impact Altair, the 4-mana 3/4 artifact creature that when it or another artifact enters, your opponent loses a life and you gain a life. These two cards kind of just do exactly what this deck wants. They're both artifacts. They both help nickel and dime. The Wreckage Wickerfolk helps set up your draws so, you don't flood, you don't screw. Starts pecking in, is really good for starting your engines if you have any start your engine cards. Pact Altair, I'm sure you've played with and against this card at this point if you've been playing a decent amount, but plays very, very nicely with Haunt the Network, right? Just giving the drain from the Thopters plus the additional drain from this being an artifact creature. So yeah, I don't think there's really an upper limit on the number of these two cards I would take. I think they're very important for the deck, some of the most important cards for it. Just below those two cards, you're looking for Grimbauble, which is the single black mana -2/-2, and Engine Rat, which is the single black mana 1/1 death touch and has the 6-mana activated ability to have each opponent lose 2 life. Grimbauble kills something, just sits there to make your Haunt the Networks better, triggers your Pact Altairs, finds more artifacts to trigger all those things. Engine Rat I found to be pretty good because it just pecks in early, gets that nickel and dime train rolling, is a mana sink at the end of the game, really can help you just steal the last 4 points. I had a deck that yesterday I was playing a game, had an Engine Rat, and it dealt like the last 12 points or something. I mega flooded, and I actually got to 12 lands, and like it just did the last few points. So, Engine Rat definitely pulls its weight in this deck, even though it's not an artifact, which is something that I'm pretty picky about, right? I'm pretty picky about my non-artifact choices in this deck, because I'm aiming for like 15 of them. You really want to make those Haunt the Networks and Pact Altair strong, and so yeah, you got to be particular about those non-artifact slots, but I do think Engine Rat is good enough to fit in there. And then, you're looking for some interaction, your spin outs, your bounce off. I really like bounce off in this deck, not only because sometimes you have really nice curve out draws where you just go play a thing, start attacking you in the air, bounce your big 4/4 Hazard of the Dunes, they can never recover, but also because there are a lot of good enter the battlefield effects in blue-black, so you can pick up your own thing, recast your Hull Drifter, or maybe save a Pact Altair from a removal spell. Just a very versatile, flexible card. I'm aiming for about 6-ish interaction spells in this deck. One of the things that makes you want interaction quite a bit is that your creatures tend not to block all that well, or at least you don't want to block with them. So, Wreckage Wickerfolk on turn 2, sure, that thing blocks just fine, but past that, you're going to want to chip in each turn with it. And then you've got something like Pact Altair, which blocks just fine. It's a 3/4 that blocks a lot of stuff, but if your opponent attacks into it with a 3/3, you don't really want to block it, risk losing it to a combat trick. Like, you really want your terrorists to stick around. So when your creatures aren't playing that role of pseudo removal, you really want to have some actual interaction. So yeah, I aim for like 6 things about it. And it's a rough number. You don't have to follow that exactly. But I think that you can't get away with no interaction. That's something that is kind of easy to fall into, actually, sometimes when you're like, well, I've got these terrors, and I've got this Haunt the Network, and I just take artifact. And then at the end, you're like, oh, crap, I only got 1 removal spell. So just be careful about that balance there. A few more commons that I don't mind filling out the deck with. I don't take these very highly, but I'm happy to play them. Number 1, Hull Drifter, the 5-mana 3/2 crew 3 flying vehicle, comes in, draws 2 cards. I've been on such a roller coaster with this card throughout the format, and I finally settled on, I like the card just fine in blue-black and in blue-white, right? Where you would care about the artifact, basically. It's nice in blue-black to be able to refill, draw into more artifacts, trigger your Pact Altairs more. This will get in a time or two, deal 6 damage. So it does a lot of things that this deck wants to do. Nimble Thopterist, the 4-mana 3/2 that makes a Thopter creature. This card's just fine there. I also like Guidelight Optimizer a fair amount in this deck. So this is the 1 and a blue 2/1 that taps to add blue mana and spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activated abilities, and it's an artifact creature itself. So it's a cheap artifact creature. You're just kind of looking for those. It might attack once or twice, but it also might ramp into a Pact Altair on turn 3. There are a good number of activated abilities through exhaust costs that you just end up in your deck. So it plays a fine role. Again, it's not a priority or anything, but if you need more artifacts, if you need to fill out your 2-drop slot, yeah, happy to play it. And then more cards that I find to fill out my decks here are just some of the generic artifacts. Number 1 that makes it in my deck pretty often is Guidelight Matrix. So this is the 2-mana artifact. When it enters, you draw a card. It's got 2 abilities: 2 tap it, saddle the mount, or 2 tap it. wake up a vehicle until end of turn. I actually did a whole 10-minute long video on this card, just going deep on where I like playing it, the cards I like comboing it with. That's from a few days ago on the YouTube channel if you want to go check that out. But the long and short of it is you want this card when you've got Haunt the Network because it's a cheap artifact that just kind of sits there, draws you into more artifacts potentially, wakes up your Hull Drifters. Maybe you've got a big vehicle like the Marshal's Path Cruiser, the 3-mana 6/5 that goes searches for a land. Nice little combo with that card. So if you're short on artifacts, if you're undershooting on that 15 count, I'm happy to play a Matrix or two, especially if I do have some vehicles. Scrap Compactor, another one that makes its way into my deck fairly often. The single mana artifact. Pay 3, tap sack it, deal 3 to something, or 6, tap sack it, destroy a creature or vehicle. Again, if you're just a little bit low in interaction, you need to up that artifact count, totally fine. Compactor and Matrix, also pretty nice ones if you do happen to end up with the Infinity for artifact cards. There's not that many of them, right? But if you do end up with, the rare Demonic Junker, the black vehicle comes and destroys something, or Memory Guardian, which is the 5-mana blue flyer that has affinity for artifacts, like, kind of nice there, makes you cast those ahead of curve. I've even been playing Camera Launcher a little more often, and this is the 3-mana 2/2, has the exhaust ability to pay 3 mana, put a counter on it, and also make a 1/1 Thopter token. So this is one that's not bad to go Guidelight Optimizer, the 2-mana dork, into this, exhaust it, plus play something else in the same turn. It makes 2 artifacts, good for your haunts, good for your terrors. Again, it's not something I prioritize, but a card that you might overlook as, oh, I just don't want this in this deck, or any deck really, but I think in this deck it's fine filler. On to the uncommons. So, of course, Haunt the Network, this is your #1 priority. You don't pass this card if you're drafting blue-black. There's I think 3 or 4 rares I would take over it. It's going to be Mu Yanling, Possession Engine, the vehicle that steals something, and yeah, I mean, those are the 2 off the top of my head that I would take. But yeah, other than that, you just want Haunt. Past that, some generically good stuff. Spike Shell Harrier, the 5-mana 4/4, comes in, bounces something. That card is just really, really strong. In general, you're going to want this in any of your blue decks, but of course does get a little bit of a bump. This being a tempo-focused blue deck and being an artifact. Transit Mage, excellent here, because you can go get your Packed Altars, go get your Spike Shell Harrier, go get any great thing. There's a lot of pretty good 4 and 5 mana artifacts in blue-black. And then Marshal's Path Cruiser. This is a card that I feel like every time I record a video, whether it's the weekly episode or it's one of the mini episodes I've been posting on YouTube, I shout out Marshal's Path Cruiser. This is the 3-mana 6/5 crew 5 vehicle, searches for a basic land, has a 5-mana Wooburg exhaust cost, but you don't need to activate that for the card to be good. And I think I shouted out because I'm still getting 6th pick, 7th pick Path Cruisers. It's just really good in a lot of decks and really good in blue-black because if you can get in that first hit for 6 on turn 4, and that happens pretty often, right? You just go play a 2-drop, play this, play maybe a Nimble Thopterus, right? The 4-mana 3/2 comes with 1/1. That allows you to attack for 6 just right there on that turn. Your opponent often won't have a good block. And once you've got that big hidden for 6, you've got them down to, probably 12 at that point. Your Haunt the Networks become all that more effective. Just so much easier to kill them, so much quicker you get to kill them. Like I mentioned a second ago, plays well with Guidelight Matrix. Paying 2 mana to animate this every turn is just a pretty good deal. So yeah, keep taking this card. If you're not taking it highly already, I would. It's great in this deck, but also very good in most decks. A few more quality uncommons to call out here. Diversion Unit is the 2-mana 2/1 flying artifact creature. You can pay blue, sack it to counter target instant or sorcery unless they pay 3. And I actually was kind of low on this card early in the format, but mostly because I was playing green decks. And when I was playing blue-green, I was like, yeah, this card isn't, it's fine. It's a fine 2-drop, but I wasn't really excited about it. Now that I've been playing more of these artifact decks, and I care about the artifact subtype, I care about the chip damage when I'm starting my engines, or, just in this blue-black deck, you just care about chip damage in general. I found it to be quite good. I take it pretty highly when I'm drafting blue-black. Carrion Cruiser is another one that is really good here. This is the 3-mana black vehicle at uncommon. It's a 3/2, crew 1. When it enters, you mill 2, then you can return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to your hands. Just a generically pretty good card. Memory Guardian. Here's one that I think is actually a little bit underrated too. This is the 5-mana 3/4 flying artifact creature with affinity for artifacts. And just like Diversion Unit, not going to be good in your green-blue decks, of course. You're just not going to have high enough artifact count. This thing's going to cost 4 mana most times. But in this deck, a lot of the time, you go 2-mana artifact, 3-mana artifact, and then on turn 4, you can play this plus something else pretty often. On a later turn, maybe you cast a Hull Drifter, you draw into this, and you can cast it for 1 mana. Yeah, it's just a super efficient card. And then one card that I've come way up on as I've reconceptualized this deck as a deck that wants to attack, that wants to end the game, is Haunted Hellride. This is the other blue-black uncommon, the vehicle. 3 mana, 3/3, crew 1. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0, gains death touch, and then untap it. I still don't think this card is amazing by any means, but makes a lot more sense when you're thinking, okay, you want a card that pushes damage. You want to have, your 1/3 flyers, your Wicker Folks, and your 1/3 blue engineer flyers that exhaust. You want to have those peck in for a little more damage. So yeah, worse than the other uncommons that we talked about so far, but perfectly playable. And then not going to talk about too many rares, but I did want to give a nod to Winter, Cursed Rider, the blue-black gold rare. This is the 3/2 for 2. It has Ward, pay 2 life. Artifacts you control have that same thing, Ward, pay 2 life. Then you can exhaust it to exile X artifact cards from your graveyard. Each other non-artifact creature gets -X until end of turn. Another card I was kind of unimpressed with when I was just drafting blue-black a little more controlly, but now that I'm drafting it more as a tempo deck, you care about a 3-powered 2-drop, you care about that Ward, pay 2 life. It's just really annoying for your opponent to have to go, okay, well, I have to kill that Pactol Terror. I'm at 8 life, that thing's gonna kill me, but by killing the Pactol Terror, I take another 2 damage, and then I might have to kill Winter eventually. That exhaust ability to wipe the field, yeah, it comes up sometimes. Sometimes you face a green deck, and they have no artifact creatures, and you just get to kind of pseudo plague wind them, destroy only their side of the board. But most of the time, yeah, I'm just seeing this as a cheap creature, attacks pretty well, and annoys the opponent. Splashing is something I do in blue-black semi-often. Usually it's for white cards. The number one card I want to splash just to get more power into the deck that I think makes sense in the deck is Embalmed Descendant. This is the black-white uncommon, the 3 mana 1/2. It's got Start Your Engines, comes in, makes a 2/2 token, and when you get to max speed, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life, you gain 1 life. So again, this deck is really good at getting to max speed with the Pactol Terrors, the cheap flyers. Ascendant's a really strong card, and it's when you get sort of late. Black-white is one of the least drafted decks, so even though it's a really strong card, people don't take it that highly. And a lot of times what I'll do when I'm drafting blue-black is I'll speculate on the white touching lands. So Scoured Barrens and Tranquil Cove, I'll anticipate maybe seeing an Ascendant, and I'm not always going to splash, even if I have the fixing. I'll look at my deck and I go, is this deck powerful enough? Like, is it just, do I have my 3 Pactol Terrors and my Haunt the Network and my Wicker Folks and my removal? If I do, then I'm like, okay, I don't need to risk the splash, but maybe it ended up slightly underpowered. I'm happy to splash Ascendant. And then lastly with this deck, I want to cover the situation you might run into where you don't see the Haunt the Network. So you're, middle of pack 2, end of pack 2, and you're like, okay, I got a pack to go. And you might want to anticipate the outcome of, I just don't see it in pack 3. In that case, I think a good backup plan is Aether Siphon, the 3 mana blue artifact that mills your opponent out and taps to draw cards. I don't love this card if your main plan is just to nickel and dime them, kill them, because your plan is like, okay, I'm pressuring, and then you play an Aether Siphon, your opponent's probably like, oh, thank goodness they played that instead of another creature, right? If that's your main plan, I think you could still play Aether Siphon. It's not the worst card, but I wouldn't think of myself as an Aether Siphon deck. But I do think it's a really good plan B if you find yourself in that spot where you're like, hey, I just haven't seen a Haunt the Network. Like I mentioned at the top, there's a really big difference between the nickel and diming bleed you out decks that do have Haunt versus the ones that don't. So if your plan is like nickel dime, I get them down to 9, and then they play a Ketradon, and you're like, well, I guess I kind of just lose now. It's just not going to be that effective. But your nickel dime cards, like the Flyers and the Pactol Terrors, they play really well with Aether Siphon too, because they help you get to max speed in a lot of cases without even attacking, because the Pactol Terrors just kind of sit there. If you find yourself in this space, I also do splash a little more often for some of the powerful, grindy white cards, because once you figure out, okay, I'm not going to be killing them on turn 5 very often, that leads you to be playing a bit of a longer game, so you can get things stable, so your Aether Siphon can take over. So that's when I will transition my deck to a bit more of the control side of things. And if that's true, then I might be splashing something like Voyage Home, which is the 7 mana blue-white signpost. It has affinity for artifacts. You draw 3 cards, you gain 3 life. Guidelight Pathmaker, the other blue-white uncommon, that's a pretty good splash. Dune Drifter, the black-white uncommon vehicle that reanimates things. That's a card that I'll play fairly often. And then if I am splashing for these cards, Ticket Tortoise is a card that I don't mind playing. The 2 mana 3/1 defender. When it enters, you make a treasure token if your opponent has more lands than you. It's 2 artifacts for draining for Pactol Terror, so that's kind of nice. Starting Column, another card that I'll play if I'm splashing these decks. So yeah, think of this as a backup plan. Think of splashing and using Siphon as a finisher as your backup plan. Because I do think if you have Haunt, you just want to build towards that. You want to maximize on Haunt and just try to kill them. And just before we move on to our next deck, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/ limited level up. So you can check out a link to that in the YouTube description or the podcast feed description, either one. If you want to help support the show, if you like the content, go check it out. We are a crowdfunded show here. We don't run ads or anything like that. So if you like what we're doing here, if you like got a bit of value, if you want to take advantage of some of the rewards we offer over there, go check that out. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Thank you so much for everybody who supports each week. Really do appreciate that. If you'd like to support in a different way, a like on the YouTube video, a subscribe if you're not already subscribed, that goes a long way too. So thank you so much. Back to the show now. Moving on to talking about blue-white artifacts. So out of the 3 Esper decks, this is the one I draft the second most, I would say. And just like blue-black, I've been drafting a lot more than I had been at the start of the format. And it's pretty straightforward. I would describe blue-white as a control-leaning mid-range deck that wants to play, just like blue-black, wants to play as many artifacts as it can, and will win through card advantage. Sometimes it just wins through playing a big vehicle ahead of schedule, but most of the time it wins because you've outcarded your opponent, you've ground them out, you've cast a few 2-for-1s, a transit mage or 2. A card I've been really impressed with as I've played more and more of this deck, one that I take fairly highly at this point, is the gold vehicle, the blue-white vehicle, Guidelight Pathmaker, 6 mana, 6/5, crew 2 vigilance. When it enters, you can search your library for an artifact, reveal it, put it on the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less, otherwise put that card into your hand. The card kind of just does it all, everything you want in this deck. It comes down, blocks really, really well, 5 toughness is huge, can often attack pretty well, plays double duty, of course, because of vigilance. It can go get either something to crew it, if you just need the board presence, or if you're already stable, you just go get the best artifact in your deck, and sometimes it's a good rare, we'll talk about some good rares to go get in a second, but yeah, I really, really love this card. Also plays great in multiples, in this deck here that I have in front of me. This is a trophy deck, and I have 3 copies of it, and the reason I say it plays well in multiples is, of course, because you can keep chaining them, right? Like, Guidelight, go get a Guidelight, go get a Guidelight, teachings for those who've been playing for 20 years, and so yeah, while this isn't quite Haunt the Network level of just like, this is busted, you want to take this early, draft a deck around it, I do think it's approximating that. I do think this card is important enough to blue-white that I consider it kind of in the same realm. So now getting into specific cards, again, we're going to start with commons, and one of the things that's nice about blue-white as a deck is that these days, white is fairly open. Most people drafting know that white is not very good. And I think this is a good place for the white cards. Specifically, the 2 good white commons, Ride's End, which is the removal spell, and Broadcast Rambler, the 5-mana vehicle, 5/4 crew 1, comes with a Thopter token. Like, both of these cards are quite strong, and I think at their best in this kind of deck, right? You care about the vehicle, of course, care about the artifact, the double artifact per Rambler. Ride's End is just a really good, efficient removal spell for a control deck. And the really nice thing about blue-white is it unlocks another good white common that basically no other deck wants. Voyager Quick Welder. This is the 2 white 2/4 artifact creature. This is artifact spells you cast, cost 1 less to cast. Not quite as good as Rambler and Ride's End, but it's a card that you get basically for free, and it's a very good card in this deck. Like, it's a card I actively want. Going to the blue commons now, you get Hull-Drifter, which I think is actually even better in blue-white than it is in blue-black. You just care a little bit more about casting a card draw spell, getting some card advantage, not necessarily killing them right away. Maybe this blocks, maybe gets in sometimes, but yeah, it's a card I'm happy to have. Hull-Drifter and Broadcast Rambler are especially nice with the Quick Welder, right? Being able to cast a Hull-Drifter on 4 or a Rambler on 4. Like, sometimes you have curve outs, kind of funny, where you do go, wait, I can just play a Rambler on 4, and then maybe the Pathmaker on 5, and you're like, well, my things are just way bigger, and I can start beating down. Doesn't always happen, but like I was talking about with blue-black, it is nice to have a deck in this format that has the potential to have an explosive start. And while blue-white has less of a chance to do that, I think, than blue-black, it still has that potential while still having good late game. Again, Bounce Off, the bounce spell, just a pretty good card to have here. Guidelight Optimizer, the 2-mana, 2/1 blue mana dork, another card that fits in nicely here. That with Quick Welder really means you can dump your hand very quickly, right? Cast your expensive things, fill up with Hull-Drifter, and then cast those cards pretty quickly, dump your hand again even after you've cast a big card draw spell. Okay, so let's talk uncommons now. There's actually a hefty handful of uncommons that are good in this deck. So we're going to talk about the gold cards first. I already talked up Guidelight Pathmaker quite a bit, the vehicle that goes searching out an artifact, but just wanted to touch on some cards that are good to go get with it. So starting with 2-drops, things that it can put on the battlefield directly. I like having a copy of Interface Ace in my blue-white decks when I have Pathmaker. This is the 2-mana 0/4 common in white. It saddles and crews with his toughness, and when it becomes tapped on your turn, you untap it. So basically, it lets you crew 2 things on your turn. Fine thing to play on too. It's nice to go be able to search this if you are a little bit behind on board. It also sometimes helps you Turn the Corner helps you get in with like double Pathmaker when otherwise you wouldn't have the creatures to safely crew with it. Tap, and if you tap too many things, your opponent attacks you back, and then it's a bit sketchy. This also allows you to crew Pathmaker, untap it, and block with the Pathmaker as well. Next up, we've got River Turn Monument, which is a rare, and this is a card that I'm actually surprised I haven't talked about just yet in this format. I think this is one of the more underrated rares in the set. And I say underrated because I see it going 7th pick sometimes. A lot of people that have played with this card know it's busted. It's actually a very, very strong card, but I think a lot of people just might not have faced it or might not have had the opportunity to play it. So this is the 2-mana rare artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it to have any number of target players each mill 2 cards. Also has an exhaust ability, 2 blue, tap it. Any number of target players, each mill cards equals the number of cards in their graveyard. So you can play this, in a slower matchup. If you just play this on turn 2 and go, every turn of the game, it's going to go mill, and the opponent's not killing you quickly, you can kill them on like turn 5 or turn 6 very easily. So that's a really good one for Pathmaker to go get. Also, if you've got River Turn Monument in your deck, Pit Automaton is a card you're going to want. This is the 2-mana 0/4 at uncommon. It's an artifact creature with Defender. Taps to add 2 colorless mana, only spend that to activate abilities. But the reason you want it, if you have River Turn Monument, and it also has the ability to tap it, copy the next exhaust ability that you activate. So copying River Turn Monuments mill equal the number of cards in their graveyard. You kill them on the spot with this combo almost every time. Like, they have to have, probably about 7 cards in their graveyard, and then you go mill you for 7, mill you 14. So if you have Pathmaker and these 2 cards, and one of them on the battlefield, you can kind of go find the other part of the combo. There's also Mendicant Core Guidelight, which is the blue-white rare. It's blue-white for a star 3. Power and toughness equal number of artifacts you control. It's got start your engines, and when you get to max speed, you can copy artifact spells by paying 1. So pretty strong card. Blue-white does have a little bit of a tough time getting to max speed, so it's a good rare, but not a busted one. But we do have a few busted rares you can go get. So Riptide Gearhulk, the blue-white Gearhulk, like, that's just a great one to go get. But also Perilous Snare. This is the 3-mana artifact that has start your engines. It exiles an on-land permanent when it enters, and when you got max speed, it gains the ability tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature or vehicle you control. So yeah, I did this yesterday. I had a deck with Pathmaker and a Snare, and just having access to this really, really strong card, one of the best cards in the set. Obviously very nice. Also, Mythic that you're only going to want to play in blue-white is Salvation Engine. This is the 4-white 6/10 crew 6 vehicle. Other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2, and whenever this vehicle attacks, return up to 1 target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. One of the members of the Limited Level Ups community, Tresio, shout out to Tresio, actually pointed out a nice little interaction with this in Interface Ace, which is that 2-mana 0/4 that crews with this toughness. Well, it's going to have 6 toughness when you have Salvation Engine on the battlefield, so Ace itself just crews it. But yeah, Salvation Engine, a pretty strong card too. Other blue-white uncommon here, Voyage Home, which is 5 blue-white sorcery, affinity for artifacts. You draw 3 cards, gain 3 life. Pretty good, like a good draw spell. There's quite a few ways to go up card advantage in blue and white. So it's not like a irreplaceable part of the deck or anything. But what I'm happy to have, I think you want generally somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 ways, 5 ways to gain card advantage, whether that's through your Pathmaker, or you've got maybe a Transit Mage, or Aether Siphon, a Hull Drifter or 2. So, if you're missing that, yeah, Voyage Home is a pretty good card draw spell. Kind of like White's commons, White's uncommons give you 2 generically good cards, then 2 kind of blue-white specific cards. So, Glory Heath Links, everybody knows this one. This is the 2-mana 2/3 lifelink. When you saddle it, you can go get a basic land. This card is just great in any white deck. Gallant Strike, really good removal spell. Another one that I think is actually a little bit underrated. So, this is the 1-white instant. Destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. Has cycling for 2 mana, so just 2 good controlling tools. You also get Guidelight Synergist, which is the 4-mana 0/4 flyer, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, so just a solid threat. So yeah, those 3 are just generically pretty good. Synergist, Lynx, and Gallant Strike, just good cards in any blue-white deck. And then another uncommon that's interesting is Tune Up, and this one is a synergy card, not just, I'm in blue-white and I have a lot of artifacts. I think you need some specific cards to make this card good. So Tune Up is the 3-white sorcery. Return target artifact from the graveyard to the battlefield. If it's a vehicle, it becomes an artifact creature. So I've played this card when I didn't have any of the, combo cards I'm looking for with it. I just had a bunch of artifacts, 18 artifacts or so, and it was fine. Got back some good stuff once in a while. But I think you really do want to combo it with the cycling vehicles. And there's 2 main ones here. There's the Tension Chariot, which is the 6-mana 6/6, cycling for a single white mana. When it enters, you get to exile an artifact or creature your opponent controls. And the Mythic Valor's Flagship, the 7-mana 7/7 first strike lifelink flying, and it has the cycling ability too, where you make pilot tokens. So if you just get this thing in the graveyard, on turn 3, reanimate with tune-up. Same with the Tension Chariot, because reanimate this on turn 4. Pretty nice to do. I think I'd want 2 of these, 2 chariots or a chariot and a flagship to really want tune-up, but a card to keep your eye out for, because it's a card that doesn't fit very many places, but I found it to be pretty good in some of these blue-white decks. Moving on to the blue uncommons you're looking for, a lot of the same stuff, like we talked about for blue-black, so your generically good blue Artifact Matters uncommons, Transit Mage, and Spikeshell Harrier, Memory Garden, that's the affinity for Artifacts Fire. Like, these are all still very, very good here. 2 cards that I actually didn't mention for blue-black, not because they're not good there, I just, just figured I'd talk about it in the blue-white section instead, are Stock Up and Ranger's Refueler, just 2 exceptionally good blue uncommons. Stock Up being the sorcery that looks at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 cards into your hand. Ranger's Refueler being the 2-mana vehicle that whenever you activate an exhaust ability, draw a card. It itself has a 4-mana exhaust ability to put a counter on it. It becomes a creature. And then unlike blue-black, where I don't think plan A is generally Aether Siphoning them, I do think Aether Siphon is a really good plan A for your blue-white control decks, where you're just kind of sitting there, creating a board stall. You just want a finisher of some sort. This is the kind of deck where it's like, yeah, I will win eventually a lot of the time. So yeah, Aether Siphon, pretty darn good here. You do have a little bit of a tough time getting to max speed, like I mentioned, but you can usually get there eventually. You got your Thoppers from your Broadcast Ramblers, or your giant 6/5 vehicle, your Pathmaker gets in a few times. So yeah, it's a little bit tougher. There's not like Drain. I don't often splash Pactile Terror in this kind of deck. And as far as splashing goes, I'm very happy to splash Haunt the Network. Like, card is just busted good. Yeah, definitely gonna splash here if I can. And for the black-white uncommons, if I am splashing black cards, I actually don't love splashing Embalmed Descendant in this deck, like I might have in the blue-black deck, because once again, you're not as good at getting to max speed, so it kind of just sits there sometimes. It's an efficient card, but it's not a card that's super high impact on turn 6 or 7 when you finally find your black mana, for example, if you're not already at max speed. But I do sometimes splash Dune Drifter. That's the black-white vehicle that reanimates things. And then one last blue uncommon to talk about is Trade the Helm. This is the 5-mana blue sorcery that you can exchange an artifact or a creature for one of your opponent's artifact or creatures. It's got cycling as well. And I think this is a card that's fairly niche. You don't want to play it in very many decks. But if you do have Guidelight Matrix, the 2-mana artifact comes in, draws you a card, that's a really good thing to trade off, right? Just leaves them with basically nothing. You've got your card already. So yeah, just, I've seen Trade the Helm in a lot of like blue-green decks, and my opponent gives me like a 2-drop, like a 3-2 vanilla 3-2. I'm like, that's still not bad here. You really want to make sure you're giving your opponent nothing of value. And I think out of all the decks, blue-white has the easiest time giving them something that, you just don't really care about. Something that's just like, all right, this thing was just sitting here. Maybe it's even like an interface ace. At worst case scenario, the 0-4. Usually the opponent can't use that well. So yeah, I just wanted to call out Trade the Helm as a niche card, but one that I think you should be on the lookout for if you've got enough Guidelight Matrices, trinkety things like that. And then lastly, we've got black-white. And black-white was the deck out of these 3 Esper decks that took me the longest to kind of wrap my head around what it was doing, why he wanted to do it. And what I've settled on is there's 2 main things. One is that Embalmed Descendant, the gold card, is just ridiculously strong, right? And if you can have a deck that supports this really well, a lot of cheap creatures, getting to start your engines max speed very quickly, it's really strong. Card is great. And like I mentioned before, you do get this a little bit later than you would some comparable uncommons, right? You don't usually see 6th pick Brood Wagons, the green-black uncommon, but you do see 6th pick Embalmed Descendant sometimes. When I first started drafting this deck, I was sort of drafting it like a bit more of a mid-rangey deck. And I don't think that's what you want to do with it, because I think that it doesn't play the late game very well. It's an aggro deck through and through. You want to lean into the start your engines, getting to max speed. You can kind of think of it like a red-black deck, but instead of red cards, you're using white cards. And so if you're a white-black aggressive deck that really wants to get to max speed, wants to start your engines, all that kind of stuff, it's actually kind of a nice place to use some of the cards that nobody else wants, like the crappy-ish looking white aggro cards that you get 9th, 10th pick. So I'm talking cards like Leonin Surveyor, the 2-mana 2/2 that has start your engines, first strike on your turn, exile it from your graveyard, pay 3, draw a card. Also something like Brightfield Glider, the single mana 1/1, Vigilance, saddle 3, gets +1/+2 in flying whenever you saddle it. So you might go this into a 2-mana 3/3. You have there's like Sundial, the vanilla creature. There's a few 3-power 2-drops turning around. It's definitely a very scrappy deck, right? And I think it's a plan B. I wouldn't generally first pick Embalmed Descendant, try to get into it. I think unlike blue-black, where the cards in blue-black are just pretty good, I think the cards that go into black-white, they're not as generically good. So the times I've been in it and I felt like it was correct to be in it, is where maybe fourth pick, I got an Embalmed Ascendant. It's something that, it's fairly open at the table. And then once we get to the wheel, all the crappy-ish white aggro cards come around. And I'm like, okay, nobody's touching white. I expect to get a few pretty good white cards. There are some good white cards floating out there, maybe even a good rare or so. And then you also get to make use of the dorky-looking aggro cards I just talked about. The white aggro cards that generally are not very good. Unsurprisingly, this deck just wants to get to max speed as quickly as possible. So you're playing 1-drops, you're playing stuff like Engine Rat, stuff like Wreckage Wickerfolk. I think Wreckage Wickerfolk might just be the best common for this deck. Just evasive, fills the grave, which is relevant in this deck too, because you do end up playing the Surveyors. I find they're solid playables here. The Leonin Surveyor, Mutant Surveyor, which is the black one, the 2/3 that can pump, get +1/+1. So, get a little bit of value there. Dune Drifter, the other black white uncommon. It's kind of nice to reanimate your utility creatures, reanimate a rat after it's traded off, reanimate Embalmed Descendant. And so largely I view this as a backdoor deck, a plan B deck, where you go through pack 1, green is completely cut off, maybe blue is completely cut off, and you're like, okay, where do I go from there? Well, that leaves you with the Mardu colors. So you're like, base black, maybe you're playing red for the good red-black gold cards, but maybe you play white for Embalmed Descendant, Dune Drifter, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's something that I would not recommend, unlike Haunt the Network, where I'm like, yeah, first pick this awesome gold card. Black-white has an awesome gold card, but the surrounding cards are not as strong. So getting to some individual cards, I think that 1-drops are just super important for this deck. Ideally, you want to go like play a 1-drop, play a 2-drop that starts your engine, so like a Leonin Surveyor, or maybe Momentum Breaker, which is the uncommon enchantment that makes your opponent sack something. And you just get in for the first 2 turns, peck in, and you're at max speed by like turn 4 ideal. So for doing that, Engine Rat, that's a nice one. There's also the Glider that I just mentioned, the saddle creature that can gain flying. There's Nesting Bot, which I think this is probably the best deck for Nesting Bot. Single white mana, 1/1 artifact creature. Start your engines. When it dies, you make a 1/1 servo token, and when you get to max speed, this creature becomes a 2/1. A couple good 1-drop rares for this deck. Voyager Glidecar, the single mana 2/3 crew 1 vehicle that when it enters, you scry 1, and you can tap 3 untapped creatures you control to turn this thing into a flyer and put a counter on it. Basri, Tomorrow's Champion, the 1 mana 2/1 that you can pay 1, tap it, make a lifelink token. Also has a cycling ability that I actually really got gotten badly by. So the cycling ability is 2 and a white to cycle it, and when you cycle this card, all cats you control gain hexproof and indestructible. My opponent had 2 Leonin Surveyors, which is the 2 mana 2/2 and white that gains first strike on your turn. And these are cats, by the way. When I made a block and they cycled their Basri and ate 2 of my creatures, like I think it was even a double block, and I was like, whoa, okay, well, that mode is actually kind of relevant. So, be on the lookout for that, just a little thing. But yeah, like really, I think if your black-white deck doesn't have 3 or 4 1-drops, it's probably not going to be that good. Unfortunately, I think this deck really just needs to be consistently getting to max speed early. Otherwise, it gets just a little too mid-rangey, a little too stalled out, a little too, okay, I didn't deal enough damage early. It's a disaster if you're ever in the mid-game and you're on like the 3rd speed level and you just can't get to that 4th and none of your cards work. So yeah, 1-drop, super important. Just like the blue-black deck, Wreckage Wickerfolk, excellent. Pact Altair, excellent. I think Broadcast Rambler, still pretty good here. The 5/4 vehicle, Maximum Overdrive, the 2 mana instant that puts a counter on something, gives it Death Touch Indestructible. Like, this is a nice card to help you keep attacking. And then taking a look at some of the cards that are explicitly start your engines payoff. So I mentioned Momentum Breaker, the 2 mana black enchantment that makes your opponent sacrifice a creature or a vehicle. If they can't do that, they discard a card. And you can also pay 2 to sack the enchantment, gain life equal to your speed. This is just a really strong card. I like this in basically any black deck, but really good here. Gastel Rider, this is the 3 mana 2/1 that has start your engines, enters, you look at your opponent's hand, take an instant or sorcery. Once you've got max speed, gets +1/+1 in menace. It's a solid card for this deck. Goes, fairly late, not a card that people really prioritize. 2 cards that I would have expected to be traps, but I actually think are pretty good. One of the cards here, Pride of the Road, is one that Sirkovitz put me on to. He was like, yeah, this card's actually doing pretty well in black-white, despite not being very good anywhere else. So the 2 cards are Pride of the Road and Hour of Victory. Pride of the Road is the 3 and a white 2/5 Vigilance. Start your engines at max speed. You get to give something double strike until end of turn. And Our Victory is the weird tuna black enchantment that has Start Your Engines. You make it 2/2 when it enters, and you can sacrifice it to Demonic Tutor. Search your library for any card put into your hand. So if you're just getting consistent max speed, I do think this card is pretty good. Ideally, you're getting a Bomb Descendant or whatever the best card in your deck is. But yeah, I wouldn't shy away from this one if you do think you have the nice curve, if you do think you're going to be consistently getting to max speed pretty early in the game. Streaking Oil Gorger. This is a card that I'm happy to play in my 5-drop slot. Like kind of a a top-end card. This is the 5-mana 3/3 flying haste with Start Your Engines, and once you get to max speed, it gains lifelink. So yeah, basically, I guess the story here is that the Start Your Engine cards are not traps, right? Like if it says Start Your Engines and you're drafting the black-white Start Your Engines deck, it's gonna be a pretty playable card, as long as you've got a bunch of 1-drops, because I do think that's really important. And then just a couple rares to call out is a Hooer, the gold card. This is black-white for a 3/2. Start Your Engines. You can sacrifice another creature to surveil one. Activate this only once per turn, and then at max speed, whenever a non-token creature dies, you make a tapped 2/2 zombie token. And probably the best card you can get for this deck, Perilous Snare. Talked about this one when we're talking about blue-white, but it's the 3-mana artifact. Start Your Engines, comes in, exiles something until this leaves, and then once you get max speed, you can put a +1/+1 counter on something by tapping it. So yeah, just a very, very strong card from this deck. So yeah, Stamp on black-white. It's a proceed with caution deck. It's okay, well, I guess nobody is doing this. I guess I'll do it kind of deck. It's not something I would just jump into, but I do think that there are going to be quite a few tables, especially in the coming weeks as people, draft more blue, draft more green, that this is going to be something that you're going to want to do, right? Keep your eye out for it. That's all I'm really trying to say here. Keep your eye out for this deck that looks like it's a bunch of crappy cards, but if you've got the payoffs and you've got the 1-drops, it's going to be a deck that once in a while, it will be right to draft in your seat. Anyways, that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you're on YouTube, you made it this far, give it a like, give it a subscribe. Next week, we've got a guest, so come back to see who that is. That's going to do it. See you next time.